starting point might just be the current situation with regards to these undersea cables. So we know they did snap earlier this month, and this, of course, had repercussions, um, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere on the African
Mm,
continent as well, I
mm.
believe. So, as it stands, what's the current situation like?
So the current situation is that internet in West Africa is quite significantly impacted. Most companies have been able to provide some services, and in many places you can send WhatsApps, you can send emails, but things like watching Netflix might be quite difficult because basically, if you imagine it like a road system, because you've got a major accident on kind of four main highways, because imagine it like that. There's four cables that have been damaged. We don't know if they've snapped, probably not quite snapped, but they've been badly damaged. And so what's happened is that all the internet traffic in that area has had to be rerouted through other cables in the region and over land, depending on the kinds of connectivity between the many countries in West Africa. And so in that space, you're seeing a kind of real impact on the internet even now. Whereas in South Africa, most of your listeners will have experienced that kind of 4 hours. I think it was a Thursday afternoon where we all had real challenges sending emails and getting messages and so on. But pretty quickly in South Africa, we were able to reroute our internet through other systems, either across the South Atlantic Ocean or through the Indian Ocean. And so for most of us here, we haven't really continued to feel the impact so much. But those who rely primarily on those four affected cables are still having some challenges. And the repair vessel is now en route to fix them, but it will probably take another couple of weeks before the system is completely back online.
Mm. I mean, without getting too much into the technical details,
Yeah.
what can you tell us about the importance of these cables, especially with keeping humanitarian efforts in mind?
Absolutely. So thanks. These cables are really the critical infrastructure of global communications. So 99% of the world's internet traffic passes through submarines, or underwater fiber optic cables. And you can go there. There's a wonderful map called submarinecablemap.com. And if your listeners click on that, you can actually see the world's cables laid out. And it's a kind of almost beautiful representation of how digital signals get sent and the different routes and pathways available. Now, from a humanitarian perspective, communication is absolutely essential, and many organizations will have offices and distribution points in different countries. So, whenever communications are impacted, it is going to become more complicated to get the kind of moment by moment live updates of what's happening in certain spaces, just to coordinate teams' movements to ensure that the supply chain is functioning as it should, because everybody is now struggling to actually be able to be in touch with one another in the way that our systems are normally built to expect.
Yeah, and of course you are a social scientist, right?
Yeah,
So I mean, we
yeah.
can leave the technical aspects to someone who can then expand on those more clearly. But your focus, I mean, you have spent some time, on a ship that
Mhm.
the crew there was responsible for maintaining much of the undersea network, and you've had this experience, right? So I'm sure you can tell us something about what exactly goes on these ships. The kind of interactions that happen, and maybe even how these ships affect industries and communities in the areas where they do operate.
Okay, absolutely. So, yeah, just to address the technical thing very briefly. I mean, I think it's important that listeners understand at least almost as much as I do, which is basically that these cables carry electronic signals, and so the internet, as we experience it, is basically made up of like positive and negative charges that get sent through these cables and then decoded into the video or the WhatsApp or whatever it is. And so when the breaks happen, it's important that we all understand that the transmission of those signals is interrupted. So yeah, in terms of how the dedicated cable repair ships operate, basically the Leon Thevenin is the primary vessel that serves African waters. There are other vessels that can come in, but these fiber optic cables are huge kind of business operations. They're usually owned by multiple stakeholders, from governments to telecoms operators. Many of them are international, almost all of them are international in terms of how they're managed. Um, and then, depending on each cable system, they will have a maintenance contract with a fiber optic repair vessel. Because whilst the breaks don't happen that often, they, like any infrastructure, it's reasonable to expect that there will be some challenges and occasional interruptions. And so, in a case like this, the Leon Thevenin has been dispatched. Its home base is in Cape Town, and luckily with this break or series of breaks, the Thevenin was in Cape Town already when the breaks happened. Whereas if you remember last year, there were multiple breaks in the Congo River Canyon, and at that time the Thevenin was in Mombasa and had to kind of go all the way down to Cape Town and then all the way up to be able to repair those Congo River breaks. And so what happens is a crew of about 60 people. They're all men. They come from all over the world, although it's mostly an African crew. There's some Filipinos and some people from France, and possibly one or two other nationalities, depending on the rotation of the crew, but mostly South Africans, with some Malagasys and various others. These men go out at sea, and they're all equipped with really specialist engineering, technical, procedural knowledge, and they go and retrieve these cables from wherever it is that the breaks have happened. It can sometimes be as deep as a kilometer under the water. They find the cable, they identify the break, and they pull it to the surface, and then they very carefully strip the cable of its protection, fix these thin fiber optic threads, which are really the size of a human hair, and they splice them back together and then reprotect the cable and return it to the ocean so that the internet can continue to function. And it's quite a complex and very involved, very intense operation. And I really think that the work that these guys do is quite remarkable.
Absolutely. And of course, when we look at the layout of these cables, right, they do tell us a story. What do they tell us about, the history of digital technology, about connectivity, and, most importantly, Africa's place in this whole story?
Yeah, part of what got me interested in cables in the first place is when I happened to be working in Angola in 2012, when the South Atlantic cable system was lit, which is the beautiful term they use for when the cable comes online. And partly it was remarkable just how much of an impact it had in terms of the possibility of being able to access the internet in Angola at that time. But also, I looked at a map of this cable and I thought it was really striking how, in the case of the South Atlantic, the cable is laid on the same routes that the slave ships used to navigate between Angola and Brazil. And it was striking to me because there are particular routes in the ocean that ships have historically used because of the currents and weather systems and so on. Um, and many of those routes have really important maritime histories. And many of them were also used by the British Telegraph Company in the 1800s to lay the first copper cables that started to connect the world and that were absolutely fundamental for British colonial efforts around the planet, India, Africa, these many different regions. And what's striking now is that we're seeing a huge investment in digital infrastructure, so fiber optic cables in particular. But a lot of that is driven by corporate interests from both the United States, to some extent Europe, but largely the US. So companies like Alphabet, the Google, and Meta, which owns Facebook, as well as companies like Huawei from China. And we're starting to see that there is a kind of scramble for Africa again in terms of who gets to wire the continent. And to some extent, with that, who then controls certain aspects of Africa's digital experience. And sometimes the term digital colonialism is used here. It's obviously very complex because different countries have different levels of kind of engagement and ability to call the shots. And in South Africa, I think we actually have quite good digital legislation and the ability to really largely ensure that the kind of internet we get is working for us. But that's not always the case across the continent. And so watching this new infrastructure emerge, we're able to see all kinds of historic links that in some cases we've seen before of external actors coming to the continent and kind of maybe taking some advantage of, in this case, data extraction. But there's also an opportunity to really shape the internet that we want at this moment, which is potentially quite exciting.
Yeah. I mean, the conversation around digital colonialism, as you quite correctly pointed out, is a complex one.
Right.
And I think it's a conversation that would take much more time than we do have, um, during this segment. But just quickly, if you could touch on it,
Sure.
do you think, as you see it, are African countries getting their fair share of the pie?
Interesting. So I think fair share of the pie, it depends how we understand the pie. So if we understand the pie to be simply getting people online, then I think increasingly African countries are largely connected. The real challenges are that you can have as much fiber optic cable as you want circling the continent. But if you don't have the infrastructure to be able to ensure that digital systems have electricity, for example, or that you're able to get the kind of the internet in inverted commas from a coastal urban area to a rural space where somebody might be relying on a cell phone to access the internet. If you don't sort out the other structures, the social structures, the political structures, the economic structures to allow people to afford it, then of course you don't have equitable distribution of internet, and the digital divide deepens. But there's another question there about the pie, which is around control. So who is controlling the ways in which the internet kind of lands across the continent, and who's making money off it? Because of course, these are sometimes very profitable systems. And again, in some places across Africa, you have governments who are able to negotiate and ensure kind of a good deal. And in other places, a lot of the skills and the talent, that people who are able to build and manage complex digital ecosystems, many of them migrate because there are better opportunities abroad. And so you'll find countries that have very few people with the technical skills to really be able to shape the internet, and also with the legal frameworks to be able to ensure that when you're negotiating as a head of a ministry of I don't know, it might be trade, or it could be infrastructure. But when you're negotiating in that space, that you have the legal support to really make sure you've got a good deal, even when you're going up against a company as established as Alphabet or Google.
Yeah, it's certainly quite a layered conversation, and one I would definitely like to pick up on in the future. But just quickly before I let you go, so earlier on we did mention that you've spent some time with the crew on one of these ships. What's your key takeaway from that experience? And of course, you are working on a book, so I mean, if you might shed some light for our listeners on that as well.
Sure, thanks. I think the key takeaway was just how lovely and human all the people working on board are. I think in my mind I kind of expected like these complex technical conversations, or I don't know what I was going in thinking I would experience. But these are family men with kids. They are people who practice religion, who have hobbies, who work out. The vessel has a wonderful little gym, and people work out really intensely there. I think just that sense of kind of purpose and mission that many of the crew have for ensuring that Africa stays online, and the sacrifices that have to be made, because many of them are at sea sometimes for 3 months at a time, and they really miss their families, and they miss these incredible, important moments, like somebody's child had a birthday, and somebody's child had a difficult exam at school, and they were worried about not being able to be there to support the child through that process. And I think it was just really striking how much human work goes into maintaining our digital infrastructure. And many of us are not even aware of that. And I really feel like these guys are kind of African continental heroes in certain ways, because it's a huge amount of work, and it's sometimes quite dangerous. It's often lonely. They're out at sea and making quite significant sacrifices to make sure that you and I are able to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Associate Professor Jess Auerbach Jahajeeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, and a blessed Ramadan to your listeners.
Thank you.